In this video, we'll be going over 10 cards which have had such a drastic effect on the game that it either changed how players play the game or had the game change around them. And at number 10, we have Infinite Impermanence. This is a card that has both a hand and on-field effect, where if you have an empty field, you can use it from your hand to negate the effects of a monster. And if it's on the field and activated like a normal trap card, it also has the same effect to negate the effect of a monster, but gains an additional effect, where for the rest of the turn it negates the effects of all spell and trap cards in the same column as it. So with Infinite Impermanence, the way this card changed the game was not in its hand effect, because it's basically just another version of Effect Veiler, and actually it's its on-field effect, which makes it so you're incentivized to not play spell and traps in the same column as your opponent's face-down spell and trap cards, because you never know if they're going to have an Infinite Impermanence in that zone and be able to negate your effect. To a lesser extent, the Mech Knights also incentivize you to not play spell and traps in the same column as your opponent's spell and traps, but Infinite Impermanence is one of the most played hand traps in the game, and definitely is more influential in making people not play spell and traps in the same column as their opponents. Even if your opponent doesn't have Infinite Impermanence, people will still avoid playing cards in the same column as your opponent's face-down cards, just because Infinite Impermanence exists. These are the kinds of cards we'll be talking about on this list, cards that have such an impact that they influence how you play the game, even if they don't actually exist in your opponent's deck. And at number 9, we have Nibiru, the Primal Being. This is another pretty new card, even newer than Infinite Impermanence as it only came out in 2019, and has the effect where, if your opponent summons 5 or more monsters during the main phase, you can then activate this card from your hand to tribute all monsters on the field, give your opponent a super token that has all the stats of the tributed monsters, and then you get to special summon Nibiru from your hand. Being able to tribute all the monsters in the field can kind of win you the game by itself in most cases, and it's an incredibly powerful hand trap effect. So the way this card changes the game is that if you're trying to get out a whole bunch of monsters, chances are you're going to count how many summons you're doing during that turn, and then think twice before performing your 5th summon. If you don't have a way to negate Nibiru by the time you have your 5th summon, and you don't know what cards in your opponent's hand, there is a chance you might just stop there, even if your opponent doesn't have a Nibiru, just in case they do. It also incentivizes people to try to get out a negate as early as possible in their combos if they want to extend past 5 summons, even if it would make their combos less efficient. Nibiru is another excellent example of a card which completely warps the game around itself, and really helps to slow down the potential of combo decks, and kind of completely counters archetypes that don't have a way to answer Nibiru natively. Just like Infinite Impermanence, there's a good chance your opponent will play around Nibiru, even if you don't actually have the card in your hand. And at number 8, we have number 101, Silent Honor Arc. This is a rank 4 Xyz monster which simply has the effect where it can detach 2 of its materials to absorb one of your opponent's face-up attack position special summoned monsters. In which case it becomes one of this card's new materials, and this card has another effect where if it would be destroyed you can detach one of its materials instead. Since Honor Arc had generic level 4 materials, it was one of the first non-destruction removal extract monsters that players got access to when it came out, and that made it an absolute powerhouse for removing destruction immune cards, like Stardust Dragon for example. And what was so influential about Silent Honor Arc was that it was such a good removal boss monster that it kind of incentivized people to summon their cards in defense position. Because Honor Arc only worked on face-up attack position cards, so if you simply summon that monster into defense position, then it couldn't be absorbed with Honor Arc. So even if your opponent didn't have Silent Honor Arc in their extra deck, during this card's heyday, most players would summon their boss monster in defense position that they didn't want their opponent to steal anyway. Nowadays, people still kinda do this, but because of Lightning Storm and not Honor Arc. Lightning Storm can destroy all of your opponent's face-up attack position monsters, and it's a great going second card. So it reintroduced the popularity of summoning your big boss monster in defense position if it wasn't destruction immune. Even if no one really uses number 101 Silent Honor Arc anymore, it was the first card that popularized summoning a monster in defense position. And at number 7, we have Evenly Matched. This is a trap card which can only be activated at the end of the battle phase if your opponent controls more cards than you do, where you then make your opponent banish a number of cards they control so that they control the same number of cards as you do. Oh, and also, if you don't control any cards, you can activate this card from your hand. Now, Evenly Matched is such a powerful card that it almost single-handedly popularized the going second deck. Before Evenly Matched, going first was always the better choice. It was so good that Konami had to limit how powerful going first was, through changing the rules of the game where you could no longer draw a card during your first turn. Even with that change, it was still incredibly powerful, and going second was just a detriment, as win percentage is heavily favored whoever went first. Evenly Matched was a start of cards that are so good if you're able to go second with them, that there are legitimate versions of the same decks that either want to go first or go second. If your opponent set up a full board of monsters or a combination of a lot of cards in the back row, but they didn't have a way to negate trap effects, then you can gain a ton of advantage by making your opponent get rid of all of their cards. The removal from Evenly Matched forces your opponent to get rid of their cards and banish them face down, which is probably one of the best forms of removal, as it bypasses almost all kinds of protection. Not even Ultimate Falcon is immune to the effects of Evenly Matched. And if you use the effect from your hand, you can just simply enter the battle phase, and then leave the battle phase to get rid of all but one of your opponent's cards, since it counts your Evenly Matched in the field as your one card. Then you can do all your plays like normal during the main phase 2 in order to set up your board. You do have to give up your main phase 1 and battle phase to use the card, but the amount of advantage you gain from wiping your opponent's entire field of indestructible monsters is kinda worth it. Evenly Matched was then followed by some more good going second cards, which made this strategy way more viable than trying to rely on just drawing a copy of Evenly Matched, thanks to cards like Dark Ruler No More and of course Lightning Storm. Evenly Matched was influential in the fact that it made going second advantageous, where multiple people playing going second decks will not want to go first at all, which was rarely a thing before Evenly Matched was released. And at number 6, we have Maxx. This is a hand trap which was released in 2011 and has the effect where you can use this during either player's turn, and you gain the effect for the rest of the turn where each time your opponent special summons a monster, you get to draw one card. Maxx is easily the strongest hand trap in the game's history, and it's kind of funny that when the card first came out, it rarely saw competitive play. It did see some competitive play, but it wasn't until later on where the problems of the card really became apparent, and the card got banned for just being too influential in its power. Basically, Maxx is so powerful that it changes the game around itself, kind of like Nibiru the Primal Being. The game literally just slows down if Maxx exists in the game, because if you start special summoning your monsters and your opponent drops a Maxx, they can chain it in response to you about to special summon a card, in order to immediately gain the advantage back of using that Maxx. So even if you stop your turn immediately so your opponent can't draw a whole bunch of cards, then you don't actually lose any advantage for using the Maxx, which is not the case for pretty much every other hand trap. And also, if you stop your turn so that your opponent doesn't draw a whole bunch for Maxx, you're basically stopping your turn early thanks to the effect of one card. It simultaneously allows you to force your opponent to stop special summoning for the rest of the turn while not losing hand advantage and potentially forcing your opponent to skip their turn, which is one of the most powerful effects in the game. Currently, Maxx is banned in the TCG and unbanned in the OCG, and the game is basically warped around Maxx in the OCG. Maxx just increases the power level of control decks that don't like to special summon a lot. It makes cards which can directly counter Maxx way more viable and necessary to open up with first if you don't want to lose to that one card, like a Call by the Grave or Crossout Designator. Maxx basically creates a game state where you need to have a counter for the card, otherwise you're going to lose out on your turn. And there's no real playing around the card like you can with Nibiru, unless you're able to special summon a whole bunch of times during your turn in order to deck out your opponent by taking the Maxx challenge, which was even mentioned in an official manga chapter. And at number 5, we have Cyber Dragon. Cyber Dragon is a level 5 monster which can special summon itself from your hand if your opponent controls a monster. Now, definitely nowhere near as powerful as Maxx, but it was a game changer, and this list is all about cards which change the game and not about the power level of the cards themselves. However, Cyber Dragon, when it was first released in 2005, was kind of overpowered in its time period. 2005 was still the era of 1900 attack beatsticks, and where tribute summons were still common even if Summon Skull Beatdown wasn't a competitive deck anymore. So if your opponent summoned out a big 1900 attack beatstick, then you could bring out Cyber Dragon and instantly beat over it, while you just normal summoned your own 1900 attack beatstick, and your opponent would have a hard time getting back from that loss of advantage. Cyber Dragon was so oppressive as a free monster you can bring out from your hand, back in the time when special summons were still pretty rare, that some people would just straight up not summon monsters during their first turn if they didn't have an answer to a potential Cyber Dragon. Cyber Dragon was also just used as tribute fodder, that way they can go into bigger boss monsters like Jinzo, and can be used later on in the graveyard for cards like Chaos Sorcerer since it was light attribute. And since Cyber Dragon acted as both a powerful free card to get on the field in order to extend, or just a really strong card to use as tribute fodder, the rest of the game kind of had to catch up to Cyber Dragon's power level. Cyber Dragon was absolutely a staple card, and was even limited on the ban list for a while during the Synchro era, because it was too strong at 3 copies, but never strong enough where it was ban-worthy. Then, Cyber Dragon got a lot of support later on in its life, which led it to be a normal card in a rogue meta deck. So sure, most people today know of Cyber Dragon since it still sees competitive play, but probably don't remember how absolutely game-changing it was when it came out. Its power level was so high that the rest of the game had to catch up to it in a hurry, and popularized the use of special summoning monsters from your hand for combos as normal part of the game. And at number 4, we have That Grass Looks Greener. This is a spell card which allows you to send a number of cards from your deck to the graveyard, equal to the surplus difference in your deck size to your opponents. So if you had 60 cards in your deck and your opponent had 40, you could send the top 20 cards of your deck to the graveyard. And with how many ridiculously good graveyard effects there are in the game, sending the top 20 cards of your deck to the graveyard could be equivalent to going plus 20 in card advantage. So it's an incredibly good effect to get off, which is why when That Grass Looks Greener was legal in the TCG, people were playing cards like Left Arm Offering, which gets rid of your entire hand to search out one spell card, just to search it out, and it was absolutely worth that cost. Now, the way this card changed the game was popularizing the use of 60 card decks, which is still sometimes a thing in the modern game, but it was a different story when That Grass Looks Greener was still legal. Because That Grass Looks Greener decks could gain so much advantage for just resolving a single card, that a good way to counter the card was to just play 60 card decks yourself. If you had a 60 card deck, then your opponent wouldn't really get anything from resolving That Grass Looks Greener, and you could completely counter the whole point of their deck during the deck building process. And because of this, a lot of decks just started playing the max cap of 60, even if they didn't want to. And decks which could take advantage of having more than 40 cards were performing a lot better in this era, of more and more people just running 60 card decks to counter That Grass Looks Greener. Grass was so strong it changed how people constructed their decks. And I think this is a first, where people changed the amount of cards they played in their deck because of one card in the game. Even if your opponent didn't have That Grass Looks Greener, chances are you would go against another person who also had a 60 card deck, not because they were playing the card, but because they were trying to counter it as well. After That Grass Looks Greener finally got banned, 60 card decks basically disappeared overnight. They still exist, don't get me wrong, but only if they directly can benefit from having that many cards, as it's still better to run the minimum amount possible so that you can actually draw the combo pieces you need. And at number 3, we have Malevolent Catastrophe. This is a trap card which has the effect that when an opponent's monster declares an attack, you can destroy all spell and trap cards in the field. So it's a full Heavy Storm-like effect. The way this card changed the game was how people place their spell and trap cards. You see, if your opponent has back row, or any cards in the field, or really anything at all, and you have traps or quick play spell cards you want to set to be able to use during your opponent's turn, you hold on to those before you enter the battle phase. Pretty much everyone sets their spell and trap cards during their main phase too who aren't Duel Links players, and Malevolent Catastrophe is the reason why. If you set your cards in your main phase 1, then attacking into this card, you would lose all your cards, which could easily be prevented by just waiting until your main phase 2 to set them. YuGiOh the Lightsworn Hunter also partially contributed to the status as well, as it was a very popular flip effect monster which could target back row in addition to monsters when it was flip face up. So if you had any set back row and you attacked into YuGiOh, chances are you would lose one of your spell and trap cards, because Lightsworns could just blow up your monsters pretty easily before the era of everyone having monster negates. So Malevolent Catastrophe causing people to change when they set their spell and traps is definitely deserving of a high spot on this list of cards that changed how players play the game. And at number 2, we have Gorz, the Emissary of Darkness. This is a card which has the effect that if you don't control any cards on your side of the field and you take damage, you can then special summon this card from your hand and activate one of its 2 effects based on the type of damage you took. Where you can either inflict damage to your opponent equal to the amount of effect damage you took, or if it was battle damage, you get to summon a token which has the same attack and defense as the amount of damage you took. So the way this card changed the game was how your opponent attacks with their monsters directly during the battle phase. Since Gorz can summon a really beefy token based on the amount of damage you take, if you're attacking into your opponent directly and they have no cards in their field, and you attacked with your strongest monster first, then they would bring out Gorz and get a super strong token that none of your other monsters would be able to attack over. So the way to counter Gorz is to simply attack with your lowest attack monsters first, ascending to your highest monsters last. This will force your opponent to activate Gorz early if they're trying to bring them out to stop you from lowering their life points to 0, in which case you can more readily attack over the token and potentially Gorz himself, which has pretty beefy stats for a monster that can special summon itself from the hand. Even if Gorz doesn't really see play in the modern era, longtime Yu-Gi-Oh fans will still attack with their lower attack monsters first and higher attack monsters last, just in case. And at number 1, we have Chaos Emperor Dragon, Envoy of the End. This card was so impactful that Konami basically created the forbidden list for it. The original effect of this card was you could pay 1,000 life points in order to send all cards in the field in both players' hands to the graveyard, and then inflict 300 points of damage to your opponent for each card sent to the graveyard with its effect. It could also bring itself out really easily by just banishing a light and dark monster from your graveyard. So it's one of the most powerful effects ever printed on a monster. And the best way to take advantage of this to make sure you were going to win that turn was to make sure one of the cards you sent to the graveyard was Sangan so that you could search out Yata-Garasu. Then you could just summon an attack with Yata-Garasu in order to make your opponent not draw cards during their next draw phase, and then just repeat infinitely until your opponent's life points reach 0. Because unless your opponent had a response in the graveyard, there was nothing they could do to come back from the combo. And generally, Konami doesn't like it when you're put in a game state where there's literally nothing you can do to come back. So they heavily restrict the cards which allow you to skip your opponent's draw phase, like Yata-Garasu or Time Seal. Both of these cards are still forbidden on the ban list to this day. Although Chaos Emperor Dragon was definitely the problem part of the combo, because it so easily allows you to set up an empty field in hand in order to lock down your opponent. If the card was unbanned with its original effect, it would still be one of the strongest cards in the game even today, almost 20 years after it came out. That's why the effect was changed to be a heavily nerfed version of itself, where it basically locks you out of using any card effects during the turn you use its effect, which was enough for them finally take the card off the ban list. Although the forbidden list exists in the first place because of how strong the card was, they basically had to make a way so that you could no longer use its super powerful effect at all, because this was before they would errata cards. So for creating the forbidden list, Chaos Emperor Dragon is a good spot to take number 1 on this list. Alright, and that's the list. There's actually a couple of other cards that changed the game a little bit, but they weren't as impactful as the top 10. So if you think I missed any other important card that should have made the list, or have ideas for future videos just like this one, I'd love to hear about them down in the comments.